the name Rebecca Makkai. Her novel, The Great Believers, has landed her everywhere from the local library and newspapers to the Seth Meyers show, the late night show. And now, well, this probably is the biggest for her of all. She's
definitely
in the studio for the Wintrust Business Lunch. Rebecca, it's great to see you again. Welcome.
Great to see you. Thanks.
So, Chicago writer, North Shore writer, how do you describe yourself?
I would call myself a Chicago writer. I live in the suburbs.
Right.
There are different ways of living in the suburbs. I'm here all the time.
I might have. I think I've read all your books: The Borrowers, the 100-Year House. There was a
Music for Wartime with my
short
collection.
story, right?
Yeah.
And now The Great Believers. This is getting the most play, right? How do you feel about that?
It is getting the most play. I think rightly so. I think it's my best book. You're not supposed to, they're not children. You're allowed to love one more than the other.
Right.
So I can just say it.
Remember the guy? Who's the guy? Remember the name? The guy who wrote Snow Falling on Cedars. I can't think of his name.
Oh, I'm going to blank too.
I know it's insulting to say that, but he told me once. He goes, "No, I believe the next book I write is always the best book."
Has to, yeah. Otherwise, you'd stop. No one's going to be like, "Yeah, I'm going to write my third best book now."
Well, I guess
that's my
true.
plan.
It wouldn't work out that well. The Great Believers has to do with the AIDS crisis in large part, and not in San Francisco or in New York, but here in Chicago. And I was struck by your research that said there really hasn't been much written about Chicago.
Not that much. In terms of actual full-length, books, in terms of movies, documentaries, even stories depicted fictionally, it's almost always about New York or San Francisco. There's
right.
so little. There's some great journalism that's done. Certainly I was able to find articles. I was able to find a few memoirish type things, but I went in thinking at least there would be the one big nonfiction book about the history of AIDS in America's third largest city. Zip.
And so here's the most moving thing maybe for me, and I told you this via Twitter. I was in Mexico on a trip helping out with a charity, and I had an advanced copy of the book, and I'm reading it. And in my group of, I think there were probably 15 or 20 of us, there were 3 or 4 young gay men, maybe early 30s or late 20s. And I'm reading this book about this AIDS crisis that I witnessed and lived through in some ways. And I'm looking at these guys who are having the time of their life, at the karaoke bar and all that. And I'm thinking they probably don't have an idea of what their forebearers, is that the right, kind of what they went through. So I took the book, I finished it, and gave it to one of them, and I hope they've been handing it around. Was that in your mind at all? Sort of not an education, but an information sort of approach?
Yeah, I think I was writing for 2 different audiences simultaneously. One being people who do not know about the AIDS crisis or the AIDS crisis in Chicago, don't know these details, whether it's because they are very young or because they were around but maybe not in a major city,
right.
or they were around and they were oblivious. And then the other group that I'm writing for is people who know this intimately. I wanted to get everything right on the detail level so that these people...
What's a woman from the north suburbs writing about gay guys in the AIDS crisis in the 80s doing? Right? Did you have that fear?
Absolutely. No, it was a very healthy fear. I asked myself that constantly. And we talk a lot in the arts about appropriation, about this question of am I being vampiric in some way, right? Ultimately, I felt, first of all, like I could do it well if I did loads of research, which I did, first-person research mostly. And then I also felt like, ultimately my question is, is publishing this going to mute more direct first-person accounts of
someone else from
right, or could it amplify those? And ultimately my answer was the latter. Partly, this is Business Lunch, so we'll say, a publishing house is so much more likely, if my book is successful,
to
so
buy
much
10
more
more,
to put money behind the book next year, 2 years from now, on similar topics from an LGBTQ voice.
One of the things you did is you brought us inside Illinois Masonic Hospital to this ward dedicated to AIDS patients.
Yeah.
I didn't know it existed, and the doctors are still around. You talk to them.
Absolutely, yeah. Dr. David Moore and Dr. David Blatt, they are married now, life partners, and they founded this dedicated AIDS care unit together, one of the first like that in the world, and became the model for compassionate AIDS care.
It's my favorite book of the year. Easily, and in part because you write about the streets I walked on. The Unabridged Bookstore, great spot. Go visit it today.
Yeah.
And all of that. So I enjoyed it so much. The Great Believers, it's called. A couple other questions. I read somewhere that you have a Facebook page, a private Facebook page for authors.
Yeah.
And you talk about strategy or appearances.
It's about money.
Yeah.
Yeah.